Today we are going to make some lamb meatballs with butternut squash ravioli and a lovely kind of butternut squash sauce. And then we're gonna whip up some cinnamon maple pecan scones for a little kind of tasty treat there. So let's start with our scones because they're gonna take a good bit of time to bake up in the oven. We're going to start with our dry ingredients, and then we'll mix our wet ingredients in another bowl and we'll add them together. We're going to start out with 2 cups of all-purpose flour. So 1, and 2. And then we're going to add in a half a cup of brown sugar. And the brown sugar works really well in this scone. You could use granulated sugar if you want to, but you're going to get a richer flavor with the brown sugar that really goes well with the maple and the pecans and the cinnamon that we're using in it. So we want a half a cup of packed brown sugar. And then we're going to add in our baking powder, our salt, and our spices. So we need 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Let's see if we'll get here. We're on the almost to the very bottom of this container. Looks like I had 2 in here. So 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a half a teaspoon of salt, and then we're going to do 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. And I like to do heaping teaspoons. And then we're going to just mix this together. I'm just going to use my pastry cutter, which is what I'm going to be using to cut the butter into it. But you want to make sure you give it a good mix. Make sure that cinnamon, the baking powder, the salt, and the sugar all gets mixed into the base of our scone. Here we go. Perfect. And now we're going to cut in 1 stick of cold butter. So I'm going to take a stick out. We're going to use a little butter in our pasta, so I'm going to put it over there. Let me grab a butter knife. I always like to cube up my butter first, and then I'll use my pastry cutter to cut it into it. But it's a little bit easier than just putting the big stick in there. So I'm going to cut it down into little kind of fourths here, and then just cut it up. This gets rid of most of the work, or at least the hard work. And you want to make sure your butter is nice and cold. Room temperature butter will give you a really firm scone, and you want these nice flaky layers in our scone. Here we go. And when your butter is nice and cold, it's much easier to cube. Okay, I'm just going to toss those with a little bit of the sugar flour mixture first. That way they don't stick as much to my blades. And then we're going to cut that butter into our flour mixture. Now, you could always do this with a food processor or 2 knives. You could even go old school and do it with your fingers where you just kind of pinch it between the flour. But I do find that for the easiest, using a pastry cutter like this with the multiple blades, it goes pretty fast. You know, the food processor, while it is super fast, you got to lug it out and then you got to clean it, and that just adds up a lot of work. So about halfway through, I kind of cut any butter that's stuck out of my little blades. That way I can make sure it all gets kind of cut in. And you're essentially going to cut this butter to where you have no pieces bigger than a pea left. If your pieces of butter are too big, what happens when you go to press your layers is you're going to get a butter void, which will melt and leave a pocket in your baked good. Here we go. Just about done. I'm going to cut many pieces of butter out here. I just take my butter knife and kind of just push it out. Here we go. finish it up, and then we'll work on our wet mixture, which is going to use our sourdough discard, vanilla, a little bit of maple syrup, and a little bit of cream, and an egg. Okay, it looks like we've got this just about cut up. So again, I'm just going to take any pieces of butter that's stuck between my blades, and you should have kind of a loose kind of crumb on here for it. So as long as you don't have any super huge chunks in here, all it is good. That's our dry mixture for our things. So let's do our wet mixture. We are going to use our sourdough discard as well as some bit of maple syrup. I'm going to grab my cream over here since we're going to need our cream as well. So you want to use, you can use active starter or discard. We're not using it for the leavening process, just as a way to speed up your starter and a way to get rid of some. So we need a 1/2 cup of our discard. There we go. Looks about good. Set this over here. And we're going to add this into our bowl, and then we're going to add in 2 tablespoons of cream, 1 egg, 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract, about 1 tablespoon of maple syrup, and that's going to be the wet base for our scones. Got our egg. Now we need our cream. And we'll be using a little bit more cream on the scones to brush the tops with. So 1, 2, and then we need about 1 tablespoon of maple syrup. Now most of the maple syrup flavor is actually going to come through on the glaze, but I do like to put just a teeny bit in our scone. So 1 tablespoon, and make sure it's real maple syrup, not some, the imitation one. And then we're going to do 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. If you want a really strong maple flavor in your scone, instead of using maple syrup, you can use maple extract. Now, I find maple extract, there we go, I'm trying to say the word right, is a bit too strong in flavor. I feel like it's a very, very strong maple flavor. So I like to use just the good old maple syrup, but I do like my maple flavors to be more mild and not very strong in their flavor, but a nice subtle hint to it. But if you do really love that flavor, use a little bit of maple extract in the batter. You could use, instead of a tablespoon of maple syrup, you could use about 1.5 teaspoons of maple extract. And you can also use it in the glaze to make it even more pronounced. Okay, we've got our wet mixture here. And then you just want to make sure your egg gets completely mixed into it. There we go. And then we're going to pour this into our dry mixture, and we will toss it with our fork until some nice dry, like a dry shag forms. And then we'll turn it out on our counter and we'll do our press and folds. Okay, so I'm just going to use my fork here, and we're going to toss it. Try not to stir it so much as you're tossing it. You don't want to knead or really mix this. You just want to mix it until you have pretty much all of that wetness gone, so that we can then turn this out on the counter and press and fold the dough together to make the lovely flaky layers. Here we go. Okay, take off any bit off of my thing right here. And then just out on your counter, just make a good working area, you're gonna dump it all out there. And it's supposed to look pretty, this is what I call a dry shag, where you've got some pieces, but it's mainly powdery. That's what you want it to look, because when we go to press and fold it together, that dry parts will go into some of those wet parts. So first we're gonna start where you press it down, and then you guys kind of pile it right back up on. As they gets more incorporated, it kind of folds on top of each other. Here we go. And this is going to create all of the wonderful flaky layers in our scone, which just is delicious. So similar to how we make biscuits as well. And I always say, for those of you who aren't really sure what a scone is, the best way that I feel like I can describe it is a mix between a cookie and a biscuit. So it's got sweetness like a cookie, texture of a biscuit, but it's not as sweet as a regular cookie. It's a little less. Here we go. And again, just scoop some of this dry mix on top. And now we're getting to it where it's kind of forming its base. And so we're gonna cut this in two equal portions, and then I'm gonna turn them into a nice kind of puck. There we go, those should be about equal. And again, just kind of press and fold your dough. When you're shaping it into a puck, don't knead it, but more just kind of push it into the shape. Now, I like to do mine into a circle so I can cut it into little, like, you know, rays almost. But you can make it into squares and cut square scones. They all bake up the same. If you like really big scones, you can definitely make one big puck and then cut it into 8 pieces. It takes a little bit longer to bake, but I find that the smaller ones bake up a little bit nicer because the insides stay a bit more tender because they don't need to bake as long. Here we go. Put any of this dry shag on there, and you're gonna press it down to about an inch, inch and a half in thickness. Here we go. Now, let me grab, I'm gonna actually start turning on this to start boiling up. We're gonna slide our pucks onto our things and then we'll cut them.
You have a question. Are sourdough scones less dry once baked?
Yes, they're not dry at all. That's one of the reasons why I really love the sourdough. Adds an extra moisture to it. And when you make them small versus big, they're even less dry because they don't bake out all of the moisture. But they'll have like, they're like a biscuit. They're really fluffy inside, but they have a nice crunchier outer shell, which makes them, again, delicious. I always feel like they're not as bad as a cookie, but you feel like you're still getting the sweetness of a cookie. Okay, we're gonna cut these each ones into 8 pieces, and then we're gonna slide them out. Don't worry if you've got some really flaky layers that are popping apart. When that butter starts to melt when they bake, they'll all fuse together. That just shows you how layerful they will be. Here we go. Tap that one right back on there. Okay, and then we're gonna do the same thing with this guy. And we'll spread it apart. We're gonna brush the tops with a little bit of cream, and we'll sprinkle a little bit of brown sugar on them. Now you always wanna spread it out. This allows it to bake up nicely, so you don't get a doughy inside and you don't have to bake it as long. There we go. Push that little one right back on there. Now I'm going to grab a little bowl. We'll put some cream in it. We'll brush it over the top, sprinkle our brown sugar, and pop these in the oven. Get my hands washed up. Okay. And I do have my oven preheated to 400 degrees. These are going to bake for about 18 minutes at 400 degrees. If you want a really nutty scone, you can put some pecans in the scone. I'm actually going to be just sprinkling pecans on the top of them. That gives, you know, a nice little thing, but you can definitely put them in the scone as well. Here we go. So we're just gonna dab it. I find it's just easier to dab the cream on top versus trying to spread it. Here we go. And this is gonna help give it a nice kind of golden color on the top when we bake it up. Because we use brown sugar in here instead of granulated sugar, these are already gonna have a richer color to them along with the cinnamon. Here we go. And then I'm gonna pull this one so it has a little bit more room. And then we're just gonna sprinkle them with a little bit of brown sugar over the top. You could also use granulated sugar or a cinnamon sugar if you want, but just enough. It gives you a little extra pop of sweetness that if you don't like glaze, you don't have to put glaze on it, and it just really just makes it lovely. You don't need a whole lot. As you can see, we're sprinkling hardly any over the top of it, but it does add an extra bit of sweetness. Here we go. Okay, let's go pop these guys in the oven. And then we can start working on our lamb meatballs that we'll bake up as well. We're gonna put these on the top rack. And again, 400 degrees, and we're going to bake them for 18 minutes. Okay, well now we're gonna start on our lamb meatballs. So we're gonna make a panade using our cream, bread, egg. We'll add our spices in, and then we'll add in our ground lamb. But you know what, before we do that, let's get our little bit of our onion caramelizing up in our pan, because it always takes a hot minute for it to get to a nice caramelization. That way, when we're done making the meatballs, we will be able to throw in our butternut squash here in just a second. So I'm going to do a simple kind of smaller dice on my onions. Not, you know, like a mince, but a smaller size. And then we're going to, for our pasta sauce that we're going to make, we're going to actually use a little bit of butter in the base of it. It's just going to make it a little bit richer, and I think will play really well with our things. So we're going to add about 1.5 tablespoons of butter. And we'll probably add a little bit more later when we're making our sauce, but we don't need too much in there right now. We're going to add our onions in, and then I'll slide this up, and we're going to start making our panade, which is going to be our base that holds our meatball together. So since we're using 1 pound of lamb, we're going to use 1 slice of bread, and we're going to soak this slice of bread in about a 1/4 cup of cream, but it's just enough cream to make this bread soggy, but we don't want it to be drenched. So you just kind of, depending on what bread you use, just kind of, you know, it's between like 2 to 4 tablespoons of cream in there. But you don't want it too wet, or it won't be as good of a binder. So we've got our slice in here, and as you can see, it's soggy enough that it's falling apart. You want to use a soft bread, not something with a chewy crust like a sourdough or crusty Italian, because you want it to get all like turn into a nice paste. Since we're using just 1 pound of meat, we're going to add in 1 egg as well, and then we're going to add in some spices. But I'm going to wash my hands because I got a little cream on them. And then we'll mix this together, and then we'll add in our meat. So we're going to use, a lot of times with lamb I do sage, but we're going to use a little different. We're going to use some herbes de Provence. We're going to add in about 1 teaspoon. And this is just kind of like, I always say, like an everything French blend. But it will pair really well. It's got some nice earthy tones into it, which will pair well with the lamb. And we're going to add in a little bit of extra oregano, about 1 teaspoon more of this. Again, add some great flavor. We're going to add in about 1 tablespoon of onion powder. And then we're going to do about 1.5 teaspoons of garlic salt. Here we go. Let me get my pan a little swirl.
Oh, you have a question? What's the best substitute for lamb for this recipe?
For this one, I would say a ground chicken would be really lovely with this, or ground turkey. I find ground chicken's a little bit juicier than turkey, but those would all be really well with this. Or even a pork. I feel like beef is it's too much of, it's got too much of a strong flavor for this one. You want something that's a little less on it. And then we're gonna add in some green onions. So I'm gonna just snip these guys up. Go. And you could, instead of doing a meatball altogether, if you do it with the ravioli, the butternut squash, you could also like cook up some like pancetta or bacon as like a protein part for it. But ground pork or ground chicken would be lovely with this. Okay. And we're just gonna use one. So I'm just gonna kind of snip it all in here. And now you're gonna go in with your hand and you're gonna mix it, but I'm gonna just make sure that my lamb is ready to mix in. That way I don't have to go in with some dirty hands here in just a second. There we go. Okay, so what we're gonna do is you're gonna first go in with our herbs that in our egg here, and you're going to squeeze it through your hands to make a paste. It is really easiest done with your hands, so you just have to get in there with it. And essentially you're making what they call a panade, which is gonna be the binder for our meatballs. I find this tastes way better than a breadcrumb base. Breadcrumb, I find, makes your meat really spongy and dry. This is gonna keep it tender, moist, and is very flavorful. So as you can see, we have our lovely base to it. You've got some chunks in there from the herbs and from the green onions, but other than that, it's all kind of mushed up here. Now we're gonna add in our pound of ground lamb. Here we go. And lamb, I always say, is such a tender meat, which is why it makes also a really lovely meatball. But we're gonna do the exact same thing where we're getting in there and we're just squeezing it through with our hands here to kind of incorporate it. And we're essentially going to do this until all of this paste is worked into our meat, and then we'll start rolling our balls. There we go. We're just about there, but you want to make sure all of this seasoning blend gets completely worked in. Otherwise, you'll have bland spots in your meatballs, and you don't want that. Okay, I'm going to turn this guy down just a little bit. We'll give it a nice little shake here. Okay, so your finished meat paste should just look like this, a nice kind of somewhat sticky meat, but it shouldn't be too liquidy. That means you added too much milk or, you know, in it, or I should say cream. I always like to use cream. I feel like milk makes it too runny. Now we're just gonna roll up our lamb balls here. Now, if you didn't want to bake these in the oven, you could make what I call little burgerettes, tiny little meat patties, and fry them up in a skillet. That would work well with this as well. So we're just gonna shake these guys. And then I'm just gonna bake these at 400 in the oven with our scones just right underneath it. And then by the time everything's done, these should be ready to pop in our pasta at the very end. Meatballs don't take very long to bake up. And you don't wanna over bake them or they'll get dry. But these should only take about 10-15 minutes to bake up in the oven. Now, the bigger the meatball you make, the longer it cooks, and vice versa. If you make really itty bitty ones, they'll cook up much faster. So you'll just have to adjust your time. I'm kind of aiming for about golf ball sized meatballs. They will shrink down some, especially since lamb is got a higher fat meat. But if you choose a meat that has higher fat, they will shrink more versus like a lean turkey. There we go. then I always end up where I have to pinch off a little bit from a few of my bigger ones because I'm never perfect at completely making them even.
You have a question. How long in the oven to make sure they're well done for those who prefer it?
So with these, well done, depending on what heat, if you do at 400, what we're doing, these, to make sure they're well done, 20 minutes would definitely be, they would be done. I always say the best way to check them, because with my meatballs, I don't cook them like medium rare or whatnot. I cook them until they're firm to touch. So if you push down on the meatball with your finger and it doesn't squish in, it's cooked all the way through. So as I will say, since these aren't super big, 20 minutes, they'd definitely be done. If you make them bigger, then you add more time, and smaller, vice versa. Okay, let's wash our hands. And we'll pop these in the oven. My onion's a little thing here. And I've got looks like I got 15, no, 13. Should really count on my map here. 13, lucky 13. We're just gonna slide these. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to rotate them, my top one, and that way I can put them on the top rack together. So you can actually see these beautiful layers in our scones here, how they puffed up and how lovely they look. They're cooking up gorgeous. Okay, I know that my scones are gonna be ready in about 8 minutes, so we'll just take them out a little bit after they're done. But while we're waiting here, let's get our butternut squash diced up, and we can start sauteing it in our lovely onion and butter mixture. We're gonna add in some garlic to this so that it will make a great flavor to our sauce. Here we go. We're gonna do about 1.5 teaspoons of our garlic. Now you can always use fresh garlic if you want to. Since this isn't the main flavor profile, garlic suffices. We got my little tongs here. We can give this a nice little stir. There we go. And just mix it around. You don't want to cook it for too long. Garlic will burn fairly easily. So I have my temperature down on a 4 because I don't want it to scorch. But don't ever leave it too unattended or it will burn. Okay, I've got some butternut squash that I peeled up. So the other day we made a dish with butternut squash in it, and I still have part of it. But I'm gonna cube up these little pieces here so that we can saute them. They're gonna get tender pretty quickly, which when you cut them this small, which is lovely. And the nice saute on them will give them great flavor. There we go. And this is gonna pair well. Right now, Costco has the butternut squash and caramelized onion ravioli, which is lovely. Especially, and I do make homemade ravioli, but if you've ever made ravioli before, it's a labor of love. I make the homemade pasta, homemade filling. So it's a lot of work. And when I'm just doing a quick lunchtime thing, I don't always want to do that much work.
You have a question. Can you go over everything that's in the lamb meatball?
Yes, so we have a pound of ground lamb, and then we made a panade using a slice of bread, 1 egg, and about, I want to say 2 or so tablespoons of cream. And you make, and then we added in about 1 tablespoon of onion powder, 1/2 teaspoon of garlic salt, about 1.5 teaspoons of herbes de Provence, and 1 teaspoon of oregano. And you kind of make a panade with that, and then you mix that base into your into your ground lamb to form our meatballs. Here we go. I'm gonna just kind of coat these up. I'm gonna turn up my heat now that we've got this squash in here. Here we go. And we're gonna let that sit and cook for a second. I'm gonna put the lid on, which will allow that squash to cook up a little bit faster than if the heat is off. It kind of steams it. We're gonna get this going. Let's make our glaze for our scones. so they will be ready to pop out here in just a second. Grab my powdered sugar. Scrape a little bit of our crumb to the side. Here we go. So we're gonna start, I've got powdered sugar is gonna be the main base of it, but we're gonna use about 2 teaspoons of cream, or not teaspoons, 2 tablespoons of cream, 2 tablespoons of maple syrup, and then we're gonna add some cinnamon in it, and then we're gonna add in some pecans as well, and then our powdered sugar. The cream here is gonna help give you a richer texture to your glaze, so it's not as runny and thin as if you were to just use the maple syrup and powdered sugar. I love the texture and like the viscosity that it makes of the glaze. So now we're gonna do 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. So 1, and this is where you're gonna get that lovely maple flavor to it. There we go. And then we're gonna add in a teaspoon of cinnamon. So that maple and that cinnamon just work so well together. Let's get my teaspoon up, that's a table. Here we go. And then before we add in our powdered sugar, we're gonna mix this together. And it's gonna be, you know, nice and runny right now, but you just wanna make sure that milk and that maple syrup gets mixed together well. Here we go. And now we're gonna add in our powdered sugar. We're gonna start with a little bit at a time. We're probably gonna use between a half a cup and a cup. But start with less and add more because you don't wanna have to add more liquid back into it. And the consistency that I'm looking for is about the texture of glue, so that it has a nice slow ooze. So this one's still a little runny. Do you see how fast it's dripping off? You want it to be a nice slow kind of drizzle. If it's too thin, it's gonna slide right off your scone. So right now we've got about probably like a half to 2/3 cup of powdered sugar in it. But you don't wanna just dump a whole cup in right away because some maple syrup is thinner than others, and depending on how thin or thick your maple syrup is, you're gonna need a little more or a little less. Here we go. We're getting close. I think we're just maybe like a teaspoon or so more. And you don't want to put too much because then it will be too thick and it will be hard to drizzle over.
You have a question? Have you ever mixed up your powdered sugar and flour?
I have not, oh, you mean like accident in a recipe? You know, I make sure I really label it out and I put my powdered sugar in a small container and my flour is in a larger one.
That's brown sugar.
Yeah, but the flour is in the same container as a brown sugar. You know, this is when I was a kid, and I did have a mess up with it. My sister and I were making cookies, and I was like 6 or 7 at the time. And we decided we were gonna make chocolate chip cookies and we needed vanilla extract. And somehow we misread that the amount of vanilla extract that we needed was 1.5 cups instead of like 1.5 teaspoons. And we go through and we're like, gosh, we don't have enough. I'll go walk to my neighbors. And at the time, our neighbors lived really far away. It was like up a huge hill and down. So I walked up and they gave me some and we still didn't have enough. So I'm like, well, I can't ask that neighbor again. So went to like 3 neighbors and then we finally got it. We mixed it up. These were the worst, runniest, awful cookies ever. And it wasn't until after the fact that we realized that we put in way too much vanilla in it. So I have learned my lesson before and have done that. I always like to check on there. Okay, let's go grab our scones out. We can check on our meatballs, then we'll throw our ravioli in. It only takes about 4 minutes to make. We'll whip up our sauce. We'll drizzle and sprinkle. Okay. So I'm gonna first check my meatballs. They're a little soft, so they still need probably, again, a couple more minutes, like 3 or so minutes. But look at our beautiful scones. The layers from the press and fold are just amazing. This one actually popped over because it had so many layers on it. But that again, those layers all from the press and fold action. But just look. Let's see if I can grab this guy up. Just, you see all of those lovely layers there? Just so many of them. And that is where you get them from the press and the fold over on it. Now we're gonna let them sit and cool before we, not cool completely, but get a little less hot before we drizzle our glaze on it, because if you put it on right now, if it's super hot, it's gonna slide right off. Okay, let me wash my hands. Okay, and then we gotta chop up some pecans here. So look at our butternut squash. You can start to sell the ones that are kind of getting a little browner in color, less bright orange, are ones that are tender. The ones that are still palish and a more vibrant bright, those are still firm. That's kind of when you can tell when they're getting to the point of being done or not, is when they get to be more translucent, they're cooked all the way through. Okay, we've got our water boiling, so let's add in our butternut squash and caramelized onion ravioli. I've never had this stuff before. It's actually really good. There we go. This only needs about 4 minutes to cook up. There we go. So we're gonna add that in there. And I'm gonna get my kale. We're gonna mince up our kale. We'll add it in here, and then we can start making the base to our sauce. And I think, get a couple more. So I'm just pulling off this stalk part because we don't want those in our pasta, because those are gonna have more of a bitter flavor and they take a lot longer to cook up. So just these nice little ends here. And then we'll throw these into saute up as well.
You have a question? Where'd you find that ravioli?
I got this from Costco. So they had it in, they always have ravioli, but they come out with seasonal ones. So I think the last time I made the bat and pumpkin ones, which was just plain ravioli. Look at this. We've got this lovely sear on it, and it's sizzling up. But yeah, just at Costco. I'm sure other grocery stores have it. I did not see it at Publix, but I'm hoping, I figured it's Rana's, or Rana's, however you pronounce it, on there. I'm gonna kind of just poke these guys down. There we go. Kind of flip them over. Okay. Now we're gonna add just a little bit more butter in, and this is gonna be to make our kind of our sauce now. I'm gonna just slide. I'm gonna turn this down to a 4, make a little basin in here. We're gonna add about a tablespoon more. So altogether we've used about 2.5 to maybe 3 tablespoons of butter. We're gonna let this melt up. And we're going to turn it down nice and low to around, now I've got it down to a 2, because I don't want, when I pour my cream in here, I don't want it to scald. There we go. We're going to add some spices in here as well to kind of heat up in that butter. So I've got a little bit of oregano. We're going to put about a teaspoon of oregano in. And about a half teaspoon of herbes de Provence. I want this to heat up in that butter. That's gonna really bring out these flavors really well. There we go. Toast that up. We've got about a minute left on our pasta or so. I'm gonna grab real quick my chicken bouillon. Where did I put it? Right here. Because we're gonna add a little bit of our chicken bouillon in here, and then we're gonna slide over and we're gonna grab our meatballs here in just a second. They should be almost done. With meatballs, you've got a good period of time before you overcook them, because they are little juicy spears on there. Okay, before we dump this out, I'm gonna ladle in a little bit of this into our thing so we don't have to use quite as much cream in it. So we're gonna start, this is about, I wanna say around a half of a cup. And I think we're gonna use up to 2 ladlefuls. So around a cup, maybe a little shy of it. And then we're gonna add in a scoop of chicken bouillon, about 1.5 teaspoons. You don't need a whole lot. This is gonna add a lot of lovely flavor to our sauce, as well as a bit of saltiness, which will be wonderful. Okay. We have that, we're gonna let that simmer here nice and low. And I'm gonna turn this off. We're gonna strain our butternut squash here. And then we will be ready to add them into our pasta in just a second. There we go. So we'll let them sit. Let's go grab our meatballs out of the oven. That way we'll have them ready as well. And then we'll finish off our sauce by adding in some cream. We'll take the flavors, we'll add in our pasta. But let's check our meatballs. Again, I can tell already looking at them they're done because they've sweated, but if they've got a nice little firm to touch, that means they're gonna be nice and ready. If they still have a squish down a little bit or a give to them, they need to cook a little bit longer. Okay, so those are our lovely lamb meatballs that we're gonna add into our pasta here in just a second. Let's get our sauce ready. We're gonna add in some cream for our butternut squash kind of ragu sauce. We'll add in our ravioli, and then we'll drizzle our scones. We're gonna add in about, I wanna say, 1/3 cup of cream. Using the pasta water allows you to use a lot less cream to make your liquid base to it, but still gives you a really lovely velvety texture to it. Here we go, and then we'll add some Parmesan cheese in here as well. But let's give it a little taste first. Delicious. Okay. So I have this nice and low. We're gonna add in our ravioli. There we go. Kind of coat it underneath it, get it in that sauce so it can soak up that flavor. And then we're gonna tuck those meatballs down in there as well so they can soak up that flavor of that sauce as well. You don't wanna have your pan on too high because you don't want your sauce to evaporate too much on there and then have your ravioli stick to the bottom. But we've got this nice butternut squash ravioli with butternut squash and kale in our pan. And we're gonna add our lamb meatballs. And the nice thing about our lamb with our, let me grab us here with the spatula. The lamb is seasoned with the same flavors that we put in our pasta. So we have the oregano and the herbs de Provence in there. So you have those flavors really working together. Here we go. Slide these guys on here. And then I'm gonna, again, just gently toss them into this sauce as much as possible to help keep them nice and tender. Just when you're working with your ravioli, now this seems to be a pretty good and hearty ravioli. Some ravioli is very delicate, so just be gentle when you're stirring it so that you don't accidentally tear one of your pieces of ravioli. Okay. Let's slide this guy out of the way. I'm gonna sprinkle a little bit of Parmesan cheese over the top of this so that it can start to melt. And then we're gonna drizzle up our glaze over and sprinkle our pecans on top of our scones here. So we're gonna add just a couple bits here. Have it melt into our sauce. And then I'm gonna turn this down to low. So it can simmer, but not necessarily cook a lot. Okay. I'm gonna get this guy right over here. Let's see our glaze. And then I'm gonna just grab my pecans. And these are chopped up. If you have full pecans, just make sure you chop them up first. Now we're gonna take our glaze and we're gonna drizzle these over. If you wanted to, you could definitely dip each scone in there if you want more of that glaze on it. I like the little drizzle. Now you wanna do it while they're still hot, but not piping hot, because when being nice and warm, it's going to heat up the glaze and allow it to melt down over our scones. Here we go. There we go. You see how we've got this nice slow drizzle, and that's just making sure you have like the right amount of powdered sugar in there to your liquid base. If it's too thin, it's gonna slide right off of your scones. This one was the one that toppled over. And then we're gonna go through and we are going to sprinkle our pecans on it. So we've got our nice little drizzle here, and then we're gonna put a couple of pecans over the top of each one. And that's gonna give you a little extra crunch, but that maple flavor and the pecans will just fare really well together. There we go. Beautiful. And voila, we've got our maple pecan and cinnamon scones, which will be absolutely lovely. Okay guys, let's get ready to serve up our lunch. I'm gonna grab my little shovel here. We'll give this a nice little stir here. Get some of this sauce and drizzle it over. And now, let me grab my little cutting board. We'll get a pasta bowl.
And do you know what you're making for dinner?
You know, I'm still kind of in the process of figuring that out. So I'm not 100% sure. Okay. For lunch today, we have our butternut squash pasta. That is in a lovely sauce filled with sautéed butternut squash, kale, onions. We made the kind of cream-based sauce using chicken bouillon, herbes de Provence, garlic salt, and a little bit of cream. And then we're going to serve that with our lamb meatballs that we also seasoned up with oregano, herbes de Provence, onion powder, and a little bit of green onions. And then of course for dessert, we will have our wonderful scones here. Let's see if we can find one of these beautiful flaky layers here with the maple glaze on it and our pecans. And just look how soft and fluffy and amazing these guys are. Well guys, thank you so much for joining us here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to do live cooking shows every single day, kind of show you what we're making for our family and hopefully teach you guys something along the way. Again, we do upload all of our videos to the link on our page, so if you ever want to recreate any of these recipes at home, you can just go to that link and search for what we made. We've got our butternut squash pasta, our ravioli with lamb meatballs, and our maple pecan scones. We also have a link to our Amazon storefront that has all of our cooking gear and gadgets in it. We've got our cutting boards, our pans, our knives, all the different things I use in the kitchen. I have them there for you guys to check out. But again, thank you so much for joining us here. Don't forget to like and subscribe.